No Father, No Son. Chapter 1. Jake and Donna. Young Jake and his dream. America had fallen in love with the style and energy of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. And America cried when on the morning of February 3rd, 1959, the Associated Press released the tragic news that their chartered plane had smashed into 1,000 pieces in a cornfield in Clear Lake, Iowa. Charles Bolin and Nancy Mayfield had been courting for exactly 1 year on the day of the tragic event, and when Charles read aloud the article in the Bridgeport Post, Nancy began to cry. And after Charles had cupped her pretty face in his hands and told her that good things can help when bad things happen, and therefore we should marry, Nancy cried even more, and the sad tears were swiftly replaced with happy ones. 10 months later, the young couple had a baby boy, and they named him Jake. Thanks to his father's lifelong friendship with a bigwig banker at Bridgeport Savings and Loan, Charles was hired. He swiftly climbed the ladder, and 2 years into employment at the institution, he landed a position in investments. He'd expected that his son would follow in his footsteps and had gone to great lengths to teach Jake the benefits of the wise use of money. A set of chores had profited Jake from age 5. And from day one, when he had taken his first bag of garbage out the back door and to the large tin can outside of the house, he'd been forced to give up half of his income to his father. By age 10, Jake had a savings account of nearly $1,000. He would learn to respect the almighty dollar, by God, was his father's words. And though his mother often worried about the prospect of a young miser, she dared not say a thing. For like his father before him, Mr. Bolin had become a very hard man. He arrived home from work every weekday by 5:30 p.m., then spent 30 minutes on the phone with brokers with whom he had direct connections. His wife never asked about his work. He insisted she stick to household chores and promised that he would respect her work privacy in return, that he would never ask about her day, what she did, how things went. This wasn't the deal that she particularly wanted, but she dared not question his demands. Their young son, Jake, though unafraid of hard work and certainly willing to accept the benefits of that work, wasn't the least bit interested in banking. To Jake, banking for a living was a shameful waste. For Jake, it was all about law enforcement. From the day he'd watched his first episode of Dragnet, he was hooked, determined to become a police officer. The idea that the story you're about to see is true fascinated Jake. "Just the facts, ma'am," was a phrase that he picked up, used and sometimes misused. His mother decided that enough was enough when one day 12-year-old Jake asked her why he wasn't permitted to go across the street to his friend's house. She'd begun a detailed reply about how by the time he arrived it'd be so close to dinner time that it'd hardly be worth the effort. She hadn't said half of what she'd intended to say when Jake interrupted with his "just the facts, ma'am" cliche. She rarely reprimanded Jake, so when she abruptly stopped him before he had a chance to finish, he was a bit taken aback. "Geez, Mom, don't be such a spaz." She throttled him by the ruff and replied, "Don't geez me, young man, and don't ever use that ridiculous dragnet phrase again. Not with me, Jake. I'm sick and tired of it." She let loose of him and continued, "Father Bishop spoke about defiant children last Sunday at Mass." She pointed at Jake. "You should have been there." She shook her finger. "Might have learned something." Speechless, Jake pulled himself from her grip, straightened his collar, and walked into his room, slammed the door behind him. He stood facing the door, 2 middle fingers accompanied by a few choice phrases silently mouthed. Jake's mother's obsession with all things Catholic was not shared with her husband. Charles Bolin hated the Catholic Church, but he certainly didn't show favoritism. He hated all things church. And while he never claimed to be an atheist, his refusal to take part in any discussion about what he called magical thinking said enough. "We will agree to disagree," he once and only once said to his wife. She properly respected his wishes. In December of 1972, Jake turned teen, and while most of his peers were spending their spare time collecting Hot Wheels and trading baseball cards, Jake was reading True Detective magazines that he'd stolen from the local Grand Union supermarket. When his mother had one morning found them under his mattress, she'd temporarily lost her breath. The cover of every other edition portrayed a young woman, usually a half-dressed blonde, tied up or holding a knife over her would-be rapist. When she confronted him with the soft porn rags, Jake claimed that he had found them on the side of the road in an old grocery bag. His mother believed him. He informed her of how he spent hours reading about detective activities and learning about the profession, and that he would someday do some of the things that the detectives did. She let him keep them, with the exception of one, Strange Detective April edition. On the cover, a bent-over brunette with only a pair of panties on, the nipples of her breast barely covered by the letters of the subtitle, Chorus Girl Forced to Do More Than Sing 24 Hours in the Nude. Jake's obsession with cop television shows increased with the availability of so many of them on prime time throughout the 70s. He spent a good part of each weekday evening in front of the television worshiping the likes of Lieutenant Riker of The Rookies and Officer Pete Malloy of Adam 12. Jake had collected posters of police shows since he was 5, and his walls were covered. He pictured himself as one of his heroes. He would lie on his bed and stare at his SWAT poster, replacing Lieutenant Hondo Harrelson with himself and imagining the attention he'd get when he was one day considered hero. It was his dream, his passion. He was sure that he was going to be the best cop in the world, by God, whether his father liked it or not. Officer Dean Palmer and the Ride-Alongs. Occupations Day was an 8th grade standard in the Bridgeport School District. At Wooster Middle School, various adults had volunteered to report on their typical workday in a 30-minute presentation. When Jake heard his English teacher mention a police officer, he nearly came out of his chair. The officer was third on the list, following a cook and a restaurant manager. Jake shot a short note to one of his friends seated in front of him. Why the hell would anyone want to become a cook? Probably 'cause they're fags. After reading the note, his friend leaned back and whispered, You spelled there wrong, Bolin. Jake quickly replied, So is it a teacher you want to be, you and your spelling lesson? A cook, a teacher, no difference, both prissy fag jobs. His friend rolled his eyes and chuckled. Jake was an expert name caller. His ability to colorfully criticize anything and anyone with a clever and unique title almost always afforded him a laugh. He yawned his way through the cook's discussion of walk-in boxes and culinary knives, and Jake couldn't help but roll his eyes at his buddies as a Denny's shift manager enthusiastically told the class about the feeling of accomplishment as he drove home every morning knowing that he'd helped to make someone's night, a truck driver, an elderly man with insomnia, just a little bit better. Lord God Almighty, Jake said under his breath. He covered his face and slouched in his chair. Officer Dean Palmer was next. He'd been on the force for 5 years. He stood 5'10". His short brown hair accentuated a rather large pair of ears. He was thin and gangly, but to Jake, he stood 10 feet and ruled the city. To Jake, this man was the ultimate everything. To Jake, he had the kind of power that all boys with dreams of someday becoming real men aspire to. He was a kind of god. He was a kind of Pete Malloy of Adam 12 with his peaked cap and his nightstick and pistol. And he had Jake's rapt attention from the moment he walked into the room and began to speak. With an authoritative low tone, he announced, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Officer Dean Palmer. Students were frozen in their places, not a move from any of the young teens. I'm a Bridgeport police officer, and I, thumb in his chest, look out, finger pointed at the crowd of students. For you. Some of the students looked at one another and smiled. He informed the students of the hierarchy of police ranks and of the history of the police department in Bridgeport and of various standard procedures learned by all officers who first joined the department. With a slight grin, he said, I may administer a pop quiz when I'm finished here, so pay close attention. Officer Palmer began to pace the front of the room, gazing into the eyes of one student, then another. Jake grinned and looked around. They're amazed, he thought. The more the officer spoke, the more enthralled the students became. He told stories ranging from the administering of moving violations to the chasing down armed felons and everything in between. He emphasized things by standing high on his toes. And if you think that being a police officer is a fun job, think again, boys and girls. His volume had slowly increased to match the emphasis he sought to place on his importance. I'm sure that by this age you have been told that Bridgeport is one of the most dangerous cities in Connecticut. And here he quieted a bit. Well, unfortunately, it's true. Now on his tippy toes. For an officer such as myself, being on the defensive is second nature. Now flat-footed and low-toned. It's not a job for everyone. Jake was on the edge of his seat, watching a master. When it came time, Jake asked all the right questions. Officer Palmer was all too happy to detail the various times he'd had to tackle a fleeing criminal or to pull his pistol from his holster. One of the girls sitting in the front row raised her hand and asked if he'd ever actually had to shoot his gun. All eyes returned to Palmer. I'm not at liberty to discuss that matter with children, young lady, but let's just say, once again, that this is not a job for the weak at heart. The girl nodded quickly, sat back, looked around at her peers, and thanked him. When he'd finished his presentation, the officer said, Time for that pop quiz, boys and girls. The students looked at one another. A boy in the back mumbled something, and a few students giggled. Jake looked at him in disapproval. When Officer Palmer asked what was funny, the mumbling boy replied that he was just nervous about the quiz. Well, let's just see if anyone can answer a few questions about rank in the police department. Didn't surprise Officer Palmer when Jake was the only one capable of answering the final pop quiz question about the order within the ranks of the police department. He rattled it off quickly and in perfect order. Yes, sir. That would be officer, detective, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major, inspector. Jake looked around at his peers and smiled. And chief of police. The students were surprised at his knowledge. Geez Louise, a fat boy in the back row shouted. How'd you know that, Bolin? Jake looked back at the boy and replied, Because I'm going to be a police officer someday, that's why. The class responded with a sarcastic, ooh. Then Jake pointed at the fat one. And I'm coming after you. An eruption of laughter followed. Seeing that he'd captured his audience, he attempted to hold on with another snide comment. And that's a quick and easy catch, right, big boy? The sudden hush of the audience caught Jake off guard. He didn't quite know what to do to regain his audience, so he turned to the policeman and asked, Am I the first kid that you've ever seen do that? The officer asked, What's that, young man? You know, Jake replied, Tell all the ranks. Oh, yes, you are, future police officer. It was the most impactful combination of words that Jake had ever heard. Here was a man who really knew about what Jake wanted. And he knew about what Jake wanted because he was living the life that Jake wanted to live. And it was clear that this police officer loved his job. Not your typical 9-to-5, the same mundane monotony every day. It was a real man's job. And Jake had no doubt that he would be a real man real soon. He smiled at the officer and replied, Yep, that's what I'm going to be. Officer Palmer smiled and said, Attaboy. Then he pulled a small piece of paper from his vest pocket and announced, Every year, one student from Worcester Middle School wins a ride-along with a Bridgeport police officer for one shift. After explaining shift and ride-along, he raised the ticket above his head. This is a ride-along ticket. This year, that police officer is me. And this year, that student is the young man who just answered a very difficult question with 100% accuracy. Jake looked around. Yes! He raised both hands, fingers splayed, and despite the lack of peer response, he blurted, Yeah, baby! A tall, gangly boy who hadn't said a word throughout the entire period shouted, Oh, geez, give it a rest, little policeman. Jake gazed at the boy and smirked. A couple of Jake's friends lightly applauded him as he took the ticket from the officer and shook his hand. Fat boy in the back received a louder applause when he snorted, Skinny little putz. He'd been waiting for his shoot-back moment. The comment had been on hold, and the moment it left his mouth, the fat one knew that it would be good. Jake barely noticed. He considered himself boy hero at Worcester Middle. He had just won a ride-along with a real-life policeman, and he was just sure that he had made an impression on his peers that would stay with him for a long time. His mom was standing in front of the television when Jake walked through the door. It wasn't often that he had something to say to her about school, but today it was different, a rare occasion indeed. Mom, I bet you won't guess what happened today. His mom was surprised at his excitement, but she was immediately sure that this happening couldn't have been anything good, probably a fight. Oh my, what happened? I'm going on a ride-along with a police officer. He came to our class today, and he asked a question about police stuff, and I got the question right. He's going to call you soon and tell you all about it. What are you talking about, Jake? A tad frustrated, Jake replied, I just told you. I'm going on a ride-along with a police officer, and he's calling you soon to tell you about it. Well, sit down, Jake, and tell me all about... Before she could finish, Jake bolted toward the kitchen, shouting, just never mind. Watch your General Hospital show. Jake had been less than respectful with his mother for the better part of his short life, but pubescence had set in, and sarcasm now reared its ugly head on a regular basis. Jake, tell me more about this, she implored. Jake threw the refrigerator door open and replied, You could talk to him about it when he calls you. I'm hungry. So his mother did turn back to her show. In fact, though she was surprised at this sudden announcement from her otherwise secretive young teenage son, she was also happy that she wouldn't be missing more of the soap opera, and she had adored these for the past decade. Besides, she could ask all the questions she wanted when this police officer called, if in fact he actually did call, and if in fact this entire police ride-along thing was really to be. When Mr. Boland arrived home from work, Jake ran out of his room and greeted his dad with the same message that he'd given his mother. His dad seemed somewhat disinterested, though he did ask a couple of questions about when and where. But that was the extent of his involvement. He patted Jake on the shoulder and said, Well, good for you, Jake. Maybe you'll change your mind about being a big, tough policeman when you find out what it's really like. He half grinned and continued, And to think that those poor stiffs don't make much more than a toothy, grinned school teacher who watches snot-nosed kids all day long. A shame, to be sure. Then he paused and looked down at Jake. Not you, of course, Jake. You're not snot-nosed. And he patted him on the back. Jake sat on his bed and thought about what his dad had said. A police officer making not much more than a school teacher was hard for him to imagine, but he knew that it must be true. His father knew everything about money and who makes a lot of it and who doesn't. I don't give a good goddamn, Jake mumbled. The Rookies poster was tacked on the wall just across from him. He looked at the brave faces of the three young cops who made, according to his father, about the same amount of money as his teachers. The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he became. He wondered how in the world a cop could be married and have kids and a house and a car and vacations without making lots of money. Then he realized that he could find out the truth when he rode along with his new police officer friend. And suddenly any doubts he had vanished at the coming event. For Jake, the 3 days that passed before the phone call had finally arrived were very long days. He'd come through the front door each day and had disrupted his mother's favorite television show, asking if she had received the call. When she'd said no, he'd slammed the door behind him after he'd entered his bedroom. When the long-awaited phone call finally arrived, Jake's mom was apprised of the details of the school program and its connection with the police department. She was to sign a form indicating her understanding and acceptance of the risks involved in an officer ride-along. To keep Jake from hounding her over the matter, she drove to the department the next day and took care of the form. On the following Saturday, Officer Malloy pulled up in his police unit, introduced himself to Jake's parents, and in short order, he and Jake were off. The ride-along wasn't so much of a life changer as it was a career confirmation. And Officer Palmer was thoroughly impressed with the charisma and the bravery of the 13-year-old throughout the evening shift. When Palmer was forced to increase his speed to nearly double the 30 miles per hour speed limit in order to gain the attention of a possible drunk driver, Jake simply looked over at his new hero and smiled. Palmer told Jake that even though ride-alongs were normally limited to one per year, he'd make an exception for an up-and-coming. Jake was beside himself. And Officer Palmer did make an exception, many exceptions, in fact. By school, Jake had become a monthly passenger. Officer Dean Palmer, the trainer, up-and-coming Jake Boland, the enthusiastic kid trainee. The two had spent many hours together in the police car, and Jake had picked up on everything he could. He listened carefully to every police dispatcher message, and Officer Palmer sensed Jake's natural inclination for police work, and he insisted that Jake ask any and all questions, so Jake did ask questions. He asked both simple and complicated questions, including questions about a police officer's pay scale. His father had been nearly correct. A police officer earned more than a teacher, though not enough to brag about. But the excitement of the job was more than compensation for a fat paycheck. "You'll do well, Officer Boland," Palmer once commented. "You know the ranks well, right?" "Yes, sir." "Aim high, Chief of Police Boland, and money will be the least of your worries." Jake turned his gaze from the police officer, stared out the window, and smiled.